The people are still arriving, but we'll get going because time's always of the essence. So just to say a big thanks for joining with us this afternoon. My name's Heather Gray. I'm the Head of Physiotherapy and Paramedicine at Glasgow Caledonian University, and I'm delighted to be hosting this webinar today. This webinar, as many of you know, is the final in our series of 4 professional development events as part of QAAS Scotland's collaborative cluster on supporting the mental well-being of our BAME and LGBTQ+ student communities. And today we're delighted to have Gareth Hughes join with us. He ran 2 fantastic sessions for us last year, one pre and one post-lockdown, and they were on student mental well-being. So just to introduce Gareth, he's a psychotherapist, researcher and author, and he is the clinical lead for Student Space, a site worth visiting, which is hosted by student minds to support student mental health during the pandemic. And he's the development lead for the University Mental Health Charter. He's currently working on an Office for Students funded project to develop guidance for academics on the relationship between student well-being and the curriculum, which we very much look forward to reading. So we're going to have some opportunities for questions. These will be at the end of Gareth's talk. So please make use of the chat function throughout the session to post any questions that you want answered at the end. Also, feel free to use the chat function to highlight any resources that you know of that you feel might help others, and we can add them to the resources that we're collating and posting on our Collaborative Cluster website. Just to remind you that we will be recording the session, which also records the chats, always worth noting, and we'll make the recording available on our cluster website after the webinar. For those of you using Twitter, the hashtag for today is #ThemesWellbeing. So that's #ThemesWellbeing. So please can I remind everyone to keep your mics muted during the session. And now, without any further delay, I'll hand over to you, Gareth. Thank you for joining with us.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you everyone for joining us for this session today. I know some of you may have heard me speak before, so I'm going to focus down very specifically on where we are in this present moment and thinking about the new academic year that's coming towards us, and about the relationship between student learning, student well-being, and whatever we're going to be looking at come September, October, November of this year, because of course it's still quite difficult to predict what all of that is going to be. So I want to start there really, because I think it's important that every now and then we take opportunities just to stop and draw breath and think about where we are. And I think that can feel like a very difficult thing to do during the course of something like this pandemic. And I think one of the reasons for that is because we still sit in this bubble of uncertainty. As we sit here right now, those of us south of the border, still uncertain as to whether there's going to be changes on the 21st of June or whether the spread of the Delta variant means that that's going to be delayed. We therefore don't know what the likely picture is going to be come September for our students or for us as staff. And uncertainty is a tricky thing for us to manage. It's a difficult thing for human beings to cope with. In some respects, bad news is easier to manage than uncertainty. And what we've been experiencing throughout the whole of the pandemic is constant ongoing uncertainty. And I think that's why people sometimes feel this kind of ongoing sense of unease or ongoing sense of kind of low level anxiety or even heightened levels of anxiety. And why it can feel difficult to just kind of settle and be sometimes during the course of it, because that uncertainty continues to just beat away like a drumbeat. What if, who knows? And certainly that's what we're seeing in amongst the data that we're getting about how students are doing. Now, the session today, I'm going to draw on a number of different sources of data, some published and some not. So I'm going to draw on some of the research that's been published, some of it very recently. I'm also going to draw on some of the information we have through Student Space in terms of what students have been using and what they've been telling us in our conversations and connections with them. And also some of the work we've been doing as part of the Education for Mental Health project. We've been talking to students through doing some co-creation work with them around the curriculum and well-being. So I'll be drawing some of that information in as well. But out of a lot of the research that's being done, students, again, talking very much about this whole issue of uncertainty. Uncertainty about their educational career, uncertainty about themselves, uncertain about what's going to happen next, about whether they're going to be good enough at the next level, about whether they're going to be able to be successful, and then about whether that's actually going to have any meaning for them in the future. We're still seeing students who are really concerned about the fact that they finished school during the pandemic, or the fact that they got their degree during the pandemic, means that it's going to be undervalued in the future. I mean that employers are going to look and see the date when they graduated and go, well, it wasn't really a proper degree compared with other people. And also uncertainty then about, well, what's that going to mean? What's the labor market going to look like? What jobs are going to exist? Is all of this going to have been worth it in the end? Which all I think then feeds into this other issue around loss of motivation and purpose, which again, particularly through the spring and into the summer has been coming through very clearly. And a lot of the data that we're getting, lots of students saying lower levels of energy, loss of motivation, loss of focus, loss of purpose. And again, loneliness being a key factor behind all of this as well. And it's the loneliness page on Studentspace is the one that has been most accessed over the course of the year. So we launched in July of last year, and so through to now, the page on loneliness has been the one that has been most accessed. So all of that is going on now. In terms of the uncertainty, as I was talking about, what uncertainty does is it puts us into a state of hyperarousal, because our response to uncertainty is driven by survival responses. So if you imagine being in the wild somewhere and there are bushes around you and there's a movement in the bushes, and it might just be the wind, but it might also be a predator. It could be a lion. What happens is our brain goes into a state of hyperarousal until we're certain that it is just the wind, so that if it is a lion, we're ready to run. So what that means is when we're in a constant uncertain situation, we constantly then sit in that place of anxiety that I talked about earlier on, that readiness to respond to a kind of threat, which then can lead to that baseline level of anxiety. And then that in turn can kind of drive us into kind of ruminative thoughts, thinking negative things about ourselves, about the future, about the current situation. And sometimes we will respond by making the whole thing want to shut down and go away. So we'll just assume everything is going to be awful, because at least then we know we have some certainty, even though we don't, but at least we can pretend to ourselves that we do. And as a result of that, we can then kind of manage and cope with that, because sometimes that can be easier to manage than uncertainty itself. So this is true for our students. Many of them have been managing this uncertainty now for a very long period of time, and actually have been doing really well. They've actually shown real resilience, and people who suggest that our students aren't resilient really ought to look at the data from the last year, because they've stayed engaged with their program. They've continued to learn under difficult circumstances. They've stayed at university. They've managed themselves through this whole process, many of them in very difficult circumstances, without good study space, in financial hardship, but they've still stuck with it despite the difficulty. But I think it's also true of staff. And I think one of the other things we have to be really aware of as we start thinking about the new year is actually where university staff are right now, because many are exhausted and are looking up towards a new academic year with, again, trepidation and concern about how much work is this going to require, how much are we going to have to do, how are we going to get through all of this, is it going to be possible? And I have a real concern that we are reaching a level at which staff well-being is very soon going to be unsustainable, and that if we don't take a step back and do something to look after our staff, that what's simply going to happen is staff will burn out and then go out sick. I think through this year, staff have done incredibly well to keep going, to be resilient, to respond to students, to demonstrate their care, to teach, to redesign their programs at short notice. But there comes a point when that isn't sustainable anymore. And I think many staff have got themselves to their desks because their desk has been at home, when really, if they'd had to go into work, they wouldn't have been well enough. But I think even that will become not possible if we don't take a pause now and think about, okay, how do we reset for next year? How do we make sure we're looking after your mental health and well-being as well as the mental health and well-being of our students? Because we can't do one without doing the other. Again, this comes back again through all of the research and all of the information gathering we've been doing. The students we've been working on the co-creation around curriculum and learning, very clearly saying to us, they know when staff well-being isn't good and they feel it and it affects them. So we have responsibility to look after staff well-being, just because it's important on its own, but also because it has an effect on our students. So if we really care about the well-being of our students, we've got to think about the well-being of our staff as well. So some of that's about our individual responsibility, but there is a larger environmental issue there in terms of within our universities. We also have to be making sure we're constructing an environment, whether it's online or on campus, that actually enables staff to have good well-being and to look after their own well-being. So all that being said, it's also just worth just stopping and thinking what it is we actually know about where our students are and what's been going on and what our students appear to have been experiencing. Now, this is constantly emerging data, and so we have to always be careful about that. But it does appear to be the case that many of our students are experiencing low levels of life satisfaction at the moment. The most recent ONS data, which came out a few weeks ago, I think suggesting student life satisfaction, I think it's on a scale of like 1 to 10, is around about 5.7, whereas for the general population, it's about 7. So students experiencing a lower level of life satisfaction than the general population as a whole. Many students with real concern about learning loss, and despite lots of the very positive things that people have been saying about online learning and the options that it gives us, a majority of students are very clearly saying that they feel that their learning has been disrupted this year, that they haven't learned as well, that they haven't performed as well academically, and are worried about whether the foundations are going to be missing for the next year. And that's not just about those students who are coming out of school into university in September. It's also about those students who have been at university this year, but feel like they haven't learned as well as they would have done had they been on campus, that there are pieces of information and understanding and skill that are missing as a result of the education experience they've had this year. And that's undermining their well-being. Clearly, there's been a big impact on social experience for students. That goes without saying, but it's really important that we don't ignore it and miss it in the whole picture, because we are social animals. As human beings, we are social creatures. We do not do well when we are separated from other people. We are herd animals. We need other people around us. We need that connection to other people. We need to feel part of a community as a whole for us to be able to thrive. And obviously that's been disrupted for all of us in the last year, but particularly for our students, because and our first year students, I think in particular, who have moved away from home, moved to sometimes to cities or places where they didn't really know many people and didn't have the social opportunities to build friendship groups. All of which I think creates this kind of loss of self-belief. A significant number of students saying they're not sure they're good enough. That level of imposter syndrome building amongst many of our student group. And of course, in the context of this series, also really important to notice that this has had disproportionate impacts on particular groups of students. Again, it's emerging data, so we've got to be careful, but it does look as if BAME students and LGBTQ+ students have probably done less well than the general student population overall. And I think there's a whole range and mix of factors as to why that's the case. There have been obviously lots of other social things going on at the same time, but we do need to acknowledge that those students may have had an even more difficult experience as a whole. And of course, this didn't start out of nowhere. We should also acknowledge that before the coronavirus pandemic hit, we were already really concerned about the mental health and well-being of our students and of our young people in the general population as a whole. So this affects mature students, but the big data that we have around this is really around the experiences of young people. And it does very much look as though more young people now are experiencing common mental health disorders than were not very long ago, 20 years ago. There has been a significant rise in that time. And that maps to what we know about the experiences of student services in universities, many seeing very significant rises in demand. And we know that that's not about worried well, but the worried well. This isn't about students who, were just mildly in distress and who previously would have just managed it for themselves, but now feel able to come forward to services. This is about students who are in significant levels of distress and who actually need support. We also know that despite that growing rise in demand, most students who need help actually still don't seek it out properly. They continue to manage themselves or to just try and get by, which is why we need whole university responses when we're thinking about the well-being of the student and staff population as a whole, because it's only by getting the environment right that we're really going to be able to address this problem. And that's particularly true when we think about the relevance of this to BAME students and LGBTQ+ students. As I said, we know that even before the pandemic, again, these two groups more likely to report negative experiences with their mental health and well-being, and to feel less of a sense of belonging, to feel that they belong less. And I'm sure in the sessions that you've had already, this has been explored. Also important to notice that both those groups also report more likely to report poor experiences from support services, that they've been to a counselling service and found a counsellor who didn't understand the problems they were experiencing, or didn't understand their point of view, or was misinterpreting things because of the background that they were coming from. So again, a real drive and a real need for us to think about our whole community within all of that. And targeted approaches to this kind of stuff are really important. And there's some really interesting and important initiatives, things like Black Students Talk at the moment, that are really helping to address some of this. But actually the solution in the end is to make sure that our universities are positive and supportive for the well-being of our whole community, staff and students together, that we actually just get this right. Because if that is the case, if we manage to get it right, the well-being of the whole population should improve. And that would then underpin those things that are crucial and key to university. So that would improve student learning and performance. It would improve staff performance and experience as well. And it would also improve research overall, because we know that problem solving, creativity, all the things that you need in order to conduct really good research are also underpinned by really good well-being. So the link between well-being and the key activities of universities is absolutely key, I think, to our future as a whole. And many of the things which we need to do and we're being asked to do by government, I think we're only really going to be able to achieve them if we put that kind of well-being lens on it and think about the fact that all of this stuff has to be delivered by people. We're talking about the experiences of human beings. And when we think about the experiences of human beings, we therefore have to think about their well-being. So we need to be thinking about the well-being of our students and our staff if we really want to move forward as universities and get all of this right. So what all of this means for our students at the moment is that there's a huge convergence of challenges around them at the moment, many overlapping and interlinked, all of them coming together to have that negative impact on their well-being overall, which is why we have that lower level of life satisfaction and lower levels of well-being, higher levels of mental distress, all of the things that we're seeing being reported through the data at the moment. And then over on top of all of this, of course, is the ongoing uncertainty about the pandemic and what's going to happen. And then around all of that, you know, this whole kind of the political instability that we have within the UK at the moment as well, which again is showing up sometimes in the therapy room, I would say, and we are seeing that kind of coming through as well. So potentially when we look at all of this, this looks like a very difficult picture. It looks like a whole convergence of a range of challenges and a range of difficulties for staff and students in terms of, you know, that are impacting then on well-being, and which then will, as a result of that, impact on those things like self-belief, like academic self-efficacy, and therefore on students' ability to perform academically, to learn, to take in, because we know when we're emotionally aroused, as we are when we're feeling when we're encountering uncertainty or we're encountering things that induce anxiety, when we feel emotionally aroused in that way, it disrupts our ability to think. It disrupts the networks in our brain that we use for learning and complex thought. And as a result of that, it's much more difficult to learn new things. It's much more difficult to problem solve. It's much more difficult to think complex thoughts. And it's much more difficult to access learning that we have already embedded into our memory. So that high level of emotional arousal and emotional distress on its own makes it much more difficult for students to learn and engage and perform academically. So it is something we need to be thinking about as we come towards the new academic year, and we need to be thinking about the coming together of well-being, learning, and the whole picture that's sitting behind all of our students. However, I think it's really important that we don't panic about all of that. And it's also really important that we don't get lost in the quagmire of all of those things. Because if we try to think about all of them, if we try to think about how we're going to address each individual one, we're going to get lost and we're going to get overwhelmed. This is the experience that our students have had. They have come through this. It has had a negative impact on the well-being of many of our students, but by no means all. Some have come through okay. But what we need to focus on is not how do we fix all of that, because we can't go back in time and change it. We can't make the experiences they've just had better. We can't make them all of that go away. But what we can focus on is, okay, how do we make the present as good as it can be? Because our emotional experiences are really mainly formed by the present, by the experiences we're having right now. The past only impacts on our well-being when it is impacting on the present. There are many things we'll have experienced in our lives. There are many things we'll have encountered that we'll have just forgotten, but therefore no longer have an impact on our present. The same is true of the future. It's only our thoughts and concerns and dreams about the future and our hopes about the future that impact on our well-being now, either positive or negative. So what we need to focus on is, how do we, this academic year, create as good a present for our students as we possibly can? And I think if we focus there, it means we do have to be aware of where our students are coming from and what we need to help them adapt from. But it means we don't need to get ourselves sucked into the quagmire of thinking, how do we fix all of that? Because it's not possible for us to do so. Aside from anything else, it's going to be so varied. You know, for the human population, variation is the norm, and that's absolutely true for students. So it's going to really vary. So different groups of students within the kind of BAME community will have had very different experiences. The same will be true within the LGBTQ+ community and in the general student body as well. trying to account for all of that and plan for all of that, I just think is just going to be too difficult. And again, it's going to be too much for staff who are themselves already overwhelmed and overstretched. And simple things really do make a difference. And I think that's a really important thing not to miss as well. And one of the things, again, that has come out from whether it's the co-creation work we've done around the curriculum, or the research that we've done around student space, or the research that other people have been doing around student wellbeing and mental health, is that staff demonstrating they care, just that, just showing that you genuinely care, has a huge impact on students, and is very often the difference between students staying at university or not, believing in themselves or not, feeling part of their cohort and their discipline and their university or not. And this isn't about you overextending yourself or for academic staff becoming counselors or anything else. This is about staying within the boundaries of your role, but demonstrating that you actually want your students to do well. You want them to enjoy the university experience, that if they're not understanding something, that you do manage to carve out a few moments to explain things to them and make sure they understand it. Showing that you care is an incredibly powerful act, and don't undervalue that. It's probably more valuable than a lot of the planned work that we do and a lot of the stuff that we structure into, you know, our ways of thinking about the year coming up. Human interaction is far more powerful than lots of the things that we do through process. So just that makes a big difference. So to really put it far, far, far too simply, and I know it's much more complex than this, but I think it's worth sometimes boiling things down to the simplest we can possibly get them. Things that I think will help in the next academic year, and I'll talk about them in more detail in a moment so we get to more of the complexity around this. But things that I think really will help is, one, to normalize the experience that students have had, that the learning loss they've had is okay. It doesn't mean they're not going to get to where they want to be. That the socialization that they haven't experienced in the way that they wanted to is okay. They can still find friends in good social groups. To reassure them that it's okay and that they can get from where they are to where they want to be. And that the feelings and emotions that they've experienced, the loss of motivation, for instance, that many students then worry about, is completely normal given what they've experienced. Uncertainty is exhausting, and that leads to demotivation. And that doesn't mean they're not good students. It doesn't mean they don't care about their subject. It doesn't mean they're not going to be successful. It just means they're having a normal human response to what has been a really abnormal situation. And then for us to help by providing clear routes for them to help them see how they can get back to where they want to be, whether that's about picking up the skills and the knowledge that they might be missing, or about rebuilding friendship groups, or whatever it might be, you know, experiences of placement, helping them to see how they can get back to where they want to be so they don't feel they've permanently lost out. We may need to simplify what we're doing. That's not about dumbing down academically. It's just about acknowledging that our students may be in a different place at the start of this academic year than we'd ideally like them to be, and that we may need to simplify what we're doing in order for them to help their way through. And I'll talk about that again in a moment. And then to make sure that as staff, you are looking after yourself, because it's really important that our staff have spare capacity to be able to respond to students and show that you care. You cannot care if you have no energy left. Caring takes energy. So we need to be able to look after ourselves. And it's important that at university level, as teams, we look after each other, as departments, we look after each other, and as a whole institutions, we place the well-being of staff on a high priority. So let me break all of that down and talk about some of these. So much of what we're talking about really are kind of key principles of teaching that many of us will know and use anyway, but we just might need to think about them in a different way this year. So the first one, which is really important always, I think, is scaffolding, is making sure that we are scaffolding the curriculum and scaffolding our learning to make sure that we are delivering our curriculum at a level that is appropriate for the learners that we have in the room rather than the learners we wish we had. What we're aiming for always, of course, is that we're moving our learners into that proximal zone of development, which is just outside their level of comfort, just beyond where they are right now, so that we're stretching them. Stretch, remember, being really good for well-being. It's good to be stretched, not good to be stressed. So we don't want to be pushing people into that anxiety zone, and also, of course, not into the boredom zone. We want them to be engaged by something that they find meaningful and interesting and challenging. And very interestingly, students that we've as part of our co-creation project, very clearly saying to us that being challenged is good. They were recounting times when they were engaged in academic work that was really difficult and really challenging, but they find it thrilling, they find it exciting. And afterwards, they were really proud of themselves. It improved their self-belief. So challenge is important, but we may have to do some assessment at the beginning of this academic year for all of our years to figure out where they are, to figure out what they're missing, because it's highly likely that some of them are going to be missing some key knowledge or understanding or skill, or that they might not really have grasped learning to learn at this level yet. They might have just about got through the last year, and they might not have the learning skills they need for the next academic year. So we need to be thinking about that. Now, there are some interesting pieces of work being done. I know Michelle Morgan, who's now at the University of East London, has a pre-arrival questionnaire that she's developed that I think has been trialled at Bournemouth. I think Leeds Beckett trialled it last year, and it's being piloted between Leeds Beckett and East London this year. But doing things like that to try and assess where your students are, what do they know, what do they not do. You can also do that through simple classroom exercises and activities to just test out at the beginning of the modules in September. Where are they? What do they know and what do they not know? And then we may need to adapt what we're doing in response. Now, that doesn't mean we have to rewrite the whole curriculum. Sometimes that's just about the practice in the classroom. I don't think we talk about that enough. We get very hooked up on the pre-prepared stuff and not so much in the fact that it might just be about going back over something or re-explaining it in a different way, or guiding students to find their way into it and giving slightly more time to it to help them build back to where they need to get to. And really importantly, to see that they've got back to where they need to be, so that they can have that belief. But we may also need to just question our curriculum and just really look at it and go, do we need to carve out a bit more space for students to catch up back up? And if so, what's really important, and are there bits we could lose out of our curriculum in the first term to make room for that space for students to have the room to grow academically, to get to the level they need to be? Again, one of the things that's come through really clearly in lots of research and also in the work we've been doing is this aspect of clarity. That when students aren't sure what they're being asked to do, or don't understand what they're being taught because they don't have the level of pre-knowledge they need to be able to engage with what's being taught, it really impacts negatively on their well-being and on their self-belief. So being really clear with students about what they're being expected to do, how they need to do it, making sure that they have understood the content that's been given to them, and that the content is being delivered at the right level where they are rather than where we would normally expect them to be, and that assessment is also at the right level for them to help to assess them, but also to help in their learning, to push that learning on. And what this really is about is again, this isn't about dumbing down, but it's about that idea of what is hard and why, which I think is a really important question, making sure that we are challenging students in the area we want to challenge them. So helpful challenges students will know what to do, and they'll understand how to do it, and they'll have the skills, or they'll know how to develop their skills. They'll be able to bring their strengths to bear, but the task we set is still going to stretch and push them. It's going to be in that proximal zone of development. The stress-inducing difficulty on the other side is where students don't really know what's required. They've got an ambiguous question, or they're being asked to do something that they've not been taught, and they don't understand how to get there. They don't understand even how to go through the process of completing the piece of work. They might lack the skill. They'll just see all the things that they can't do as a result. But actually, if they knew all of that, the task itself might not be that tricky. So that's the kind of essentialist position on either side. And what we're really looking for is to put in helpful challenge to help students rebuild the lost learning they might have, and to build that self-belief. Because it's through that challenge that students will build their belief in themselves. So we need to help them believe they can do it in the first place, and then recognize the good work that they have done as they come through all of that. So one of the other things we need to consider particularly this year is the social experience that many of our students will have had up until this point, and that they're going to need in the next academic year. Obviously, most of us probably spend quite a bit of time with our first year students most years trying to make sure that they are socially integrating into their new university. But actually this year, it's really important that we think about that right across all of the years, because it's normal for there to be some fluidity between friendship groups from year to year, and particularly going into the second year, we very often see friendship groups breaking down and people moving into new friendship groups. The problem, of course, being that over the last year, while some of those friendships may have broken down, students won't necessarily have had the social opportunities to find new friendship groups. So what that means is we have to pay much more attention to where our students are socially, and ensuring that they're able to find that sense of belonging again, to reconnect, to find new groups, and for all of that to kind of continue working for them socially. There may be opportunities in all of that to help our particular second, third, and fourth year students kind of reintegrate and refine their feet by actually getting them to act as mentors to years below them. We know that one of the ways in which you can most effectively help people who are experiencing loneliness, for instance, is to get them to focus on other people and to focus on helping other people socially. So that maybe give us an opportunity and help us to actually address the problems that we are seeing and experiencing with our student groups. But I think it is really important that we are very clearly thinking about what's going on socially, because we know that over the last year, one of the key things our students are saying that they've been experiencing problems with, as we've seen, is loneliness. Certainly with the student-based pages, loneliness is the one that's been accessed most. So we have to give particular attention to that, I think. And that flows then into our learning spaces, that we are ensuring that the learning spaces that we're establishing, whether they're classrooms, labs, lecture theatres, studios, wherever it is, that they feel psychologically safe, that they are collaborative spaces in which everyone is working towards building the learning of everyone else. We know that collaborative learning spaces are much more effective for the learning of every student in there than competitive learning spaces. Competitive learning spaces can be good for some students, but generally even the better students do better in collaborative learning spaces overall, and making sure that students are able to accept their mistakes, accept the things that they don't know, that it's okay to get things wrong, because that way they can then authentically engage with their learning, identify where there are gaps. You can identify where there are gaps, and then together you can kind of build that learning, build that knowledge, understanding, and wisdom as things go on. And particularly, of course, for this series of webinars, thinking about the fact that for some of our students, higher education classrooms feel like particularly alien environments. The language that's being used, the experiences that are being recounted, can in themselves become barriers to learning, because remember that the acquisition of knowledge requires pre-knowledge. And if our students are encountering environments and knowledge which feels alien to them, which feels completely outside of their experience, they then feel alienated from that learning, they feel distanced, they disengage, and they're much more likely then to learn and to perform academically below their overall potential, and to feel that sense of disengagement and lack of belonging. Now, within all of this, again, one of the key things we need to be obviously thinking about is the way in which we assess our students. There's been an awful lot of attention, I think, within debate and discussion, particularly since the pandemic has struck, about particular types of learning space and particular types of assessment, about whether we should abandon exams forever. Now that we've gone without them for 1 year, do we ever need them again when they are such a problematic method of assessment? The really interesting thing from the research we've been doing with students is that for them, the what of this is much less important than the how and the why. And what I mean by that is they're actually much less focused on the particular type of assessment. For some students, exams are stressful, but for others, they're not. They're a way of demonstrating their knowledge that they're really comfortable with. They've practiced it a lot. They know what's expected of them, and therefore it's a type of assessment that they prefer. What comes out is that what students need, if we go back to that slide earlier when we were thinking about what is difficult and why, is that they're properly prepared for the assessment, that they understand what they're being asked to do, why they're being asked to do it, and how they need to engage with that particular type of assessment. When that is in place, the actual type of assessment matters a lot less. Now, that's a tricky thing for us to get our heads around, because it's much easier for us to think about, well, should we just drop that type of assessment and use this type? But actually, the picture that emerges is a much more subtle and nuanced one, which is that actually we need to be thinking about how our students' assessments fit within the curriculum overall, how we teach them to be ready for the assessment, what formative method of assessment are we using that means by the time that they get to their actual assessment, they feel ready, they feel in control, they know what's expected, they recognize that they have the skills, but the assessment then is just testing their actual academic ability rather than the pre-preparation that they've had. Again, coming back from students very clearly is this idea of a need of a range of assessments, because different people perform better at different types of assessment. So giving people a range of assessments means that really everyone gets their opportunity to shine at the thing that they're best at. And again, I recommend the Campbell et al. Report, which is released recently on the experiences of BAME students particularly. We know that students experience assessment differently depending on their background. And again, some students really actually preferring exams because that's what they've been trained to do. They've been drilled for years to do assessment by exam. So they're comfortable with it. Sometimes actually less comfortable in the kinds of things that we think we might give them because they're less stressful. Asking people to write reports if they don't know what a report is actually can be a much more stressful experience than sitting an exam. And all of this, of course, comes down to the kind of preparation that we are giving students. Again, going back to that point of not making the assumption about what our students are able to do, what skill they have, and us not making the judgment as academics who have been around for a while that, well, doing X is easy, you just do. And forgetting that actually there was a point where we had to learn how to do that. The phrase I really like around that is, there's a danger that we become butterflies who forget we were once caterpillars. Many of our students have had very different preparations. Some of our students are absolutely have been trained and ready, and they're ready for active learning, but some aren't. And if you're suddenly being asked to engage in active learning and to own your own learning journey, and you've never had the opportunity to develop the skills to do that, that's a huge task. That's a really big ask that we're making of those students. So we need to be clear that we are developing student skills. And that key thing is, if students need to do something, know it or understand it, we must teach it. We must explicitly give them the opportunity to develop those skills. And that needs to happen within our discipline. We know that those kind of generic study skills training things work much less well than something that's embedded actually into the curriculum itself. So it's not just learning how to study at higher education level. It's how do I study as an American studies student? How do I study as an engineering student? So that it's embedded deep within the discipline overall. And what all of this really adds up to, really importantly, is about meaning and relevance. And again, students themselves identify very clearly that learning is most beneficial to their well-being, but also that learning is most effective when they're able to feel that what they're learning has meaning and relevance for them. And that's why that point earlier on about the fact that some students find the classroom alien is so important. We must be connecting to what is meaningful for each of our students. Now, students find that meaning in a range of different ways. For some students, it's about the ability to apply their learning to real world circumstances and real world situations, being able to go out and think about how this has affected them or their family or society or whatever. Or it might be, thinking about applying it to placements or in workplaces where they are currently at the moment, or thinking about workplaces they might be in the future. So making that connection to the real world can really help with that. For some students, it might be about connecting to things that they're passionate about. Within our research, there was one of the students who talked about the fact that environmental science wasn't something they were ever really interested in until a lecturer helped them make the connection between that and social justice. And once they made that impact, that link, actually suddenly it became a subject they were passionately interested in. It became the thing that was their favorite module that they got most from, and something that they want to pursue in future studies. And actually, if we can begin with material that gains the students' interest, that gets our students engaged with content that is meaningful, then the other drier stuff that we have to work through that's perhaps less exciting, it's much easier for them to then work through that material because they have this connection and meaningfulness embedded into what they're learning overall. On the opposite side of that, of course, the other side of this, when students don't find meaning or relevance in what they're learning, it's much more difficult for them to maintain engagement. And then we see that negative impact on their well-being overall and on their learning, because that lack of meaning then just becomes disenchanting. They start to disengage. They start to doubt themselves. They wonder if it's them, you get all that kind of imposter syndrome stuff bubbling up. So we need to be thinking about how we are engaging the classroom and connecting the learning to things that are meaningful and relevant to them and to the real world overall. And then the other thing I think that's really important for us to think about is how we're coordinating all of this across the whole of the university. Because we know that where gaps exist within universities, students will fall through. So we have to try and make the effort for those of us in student services and those of us who are in academic roles to be talking to each other, to be working together in a collaborative way. We know that how academic staff signpost students to student services makes a real difference as to whether or not students actually then go and access the service. There's a service over there that might help, much less effective than, I know the guys in student services, they've supported loads of my students before, they're really good, go and see them, they'll really help you. But we also, I think, need to think about how those of us in student services are supporting our academic staff to think about student wellbeing and the curriculum as a whole. And that's a challenge, I think, to those of us in student services. But we need to be trying to work together and share our expertise, share our learning, and share the burden of all of this between us, so that we're all as a whole community supporting each other and supporting our students. I think leaving individual members of staff to try and do this on their own, again, I just think isn't going to be sustainable. There are resources out there around. I'll highlight Student Space because it's one that I've worked on and I'm very proud of. We do think that the core of the Student Space site will be around, hopefully into next year. We're just having conversations about extending the funding at the moment, so we're hoping that will be around into the next academic year. Lots of resources on there for your students, but also hopefully for you. Do go and have a look at the advice and information section on there. That might be helpful for your students. And so just before I come to the questions, just to kind of summarize that, I do think we really need this year to focus on what matters in order to strip out the things that don't, so that we're not burning ourselves out. That thinking about scaffolding and building academic skill so that we can build our students' confidence, normalize that learning loss and help them to see how they can get back to where they otherwise would have been. And enable that social connection. Let's build those communities back up again so that our students can feel part of that. As part of that, we need to be part of our own communities, working in a coordinated manner together. And please do try wherever you can to be kind to yourself, be kind to your colleagues. If you're a manager, be kind to your staff. If you're a leader, be kind to everyone within your whole institution, because it really is going to matter this year for universities to get through all of this, and for us to give our students the support that they're going to need, to give them that good present, which is going to allow them to then move on from everything they've experienced, have a good experience of university, have good well-being and good learning, and then move off to have the careers in the new world, however it's going to look. So I will pause and stop there, and hopefully there will be some questions, but I hope that has been a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully useful.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Gareth. Yeah, more than a whistle-stop tour, lots of information that we can go back to. So I do have a few questions that have come in the chat. If that's okay, I'll throw them your direction. One of the questions here is, what kind of advice would you give to us for our BAME and LGBTQ plus students? So, what can we do for them without creating a sense of othering or looking like we're singling, groups out at maybe the perceived expense of others? Any suggestions there, please?
Yeah, I mean, it depends really on, I guess, on your discipline as well. But I think looking for opportunities to talk about different experiences, and I think one of the other things that's really important actually is there's the stuff we do in preparation and planning, but actually some of the work that I know people like in Cassie Stoll have been doing is actually looking at how we respond to our students. So when students bring their own experiences into the room, when they talk about their own thoughts and ideas and where those things have come from, that we demonstrate that they have value and that we care. I know around the charter we did a couple of focus groups with BAME students, and when they were saying that, that, for instance, they were sometimes being asked, why are you always writing about BAME issues? Or why are you using this language rather than or being asked to explain aspects of their own language in a way that other students might not necessarily be, or that their experience isn't representative in some way. So actually, I think some of it is about encouraging our students to be able and willing to share their own experiences in the classroom, to share their own thoughts, ideas, and identity in the classroom, and to demonstrate acceptance of that and respect of that, and putting a value on it, demonstrating that actually that has enriched the learning space, that by bringing their experiences into the classroom, that has enriched the learning space for everyone. And I think that's almost as important, even more important than some of the pre-planned stuff that we do when we think about, maybe decolonizing the curriculum or reaching out to LGBTQ plus students. Because I think that then shows that they're valued, shows that they have belonging, helps them to see how they can connect together the things that you're teaching them with the things that they've already learned and know and understand, and gives them a platform to move forward. And it also does that thing about creating, helping to create that environment in the classroom, that collaborative environment in the classroom, that then feels safe for them, that then allows them to learn, to drop the guard and to be able to be vulnerable, and to allow the learning to take place. So I think that our responses, I think, really, really matter. And then looking for your opportunities when you're within your discipline to highlight examples and to think about the way in which you pick your case studies and those kinds of things. Those things really make a difference. But trying, not doing it in a tokenistic way. But I think really responding to your students as people and respecting and valuing what they bring into the classroom, I think, is probably one of the most powerful things we can do.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, another question here. many colleagues on my team are exhausted. I think we can relate to that. What are some ideas that you've seen that are good for, you know, staff providing mutual support to help each other?
So team culture around work practice really matters. We normalize to the environment that we're in. So if everybody in the team behaves in one way around work, then everyone else will adapt to it as well. So setting agreements as a team about how you're going to approach work for the next academic year will really help. And there are some basic things that are really important. One is that once you work beyond a certain number of hours a week, you actually become less productive. It takes longer and longer and longer to do things because you're getting more and more and more exhausted, and you're more likely to make mistakes that you then have to go back and unpick. Now, there's disagreement about where exactly this is. 40 is definitely the maximum, by the way. There is some suggestion that actually for people who work with their brains particularly, it's about 6 hours a day for a 5-day week. But so not overworking, because actually what will happen with overworking is that wherever this is possible, and I appreciate there are cultures and environments which make it very difficult, but resisting the lure of overworking, because actually what it does is it means you'll get less done across the course of the entire academic year. Sleep really matters, and sleeping at night at the right time really matters, so not working late. And also little things like taking breaks, even mini breaks of a few minutes, have a big impact on productivity. But we know that taking a proper lunch break away from your desk for half an hour each day has a huge effect on how productive you are in the afternoon. So this is not saying that there's not a huge amount of work that you've got to get through, but that you're likely to maintain your productivity and your overall performance if you actually step away from work, because your brain needs a chance to rest. It also needs a chance to embed whatever learning you've picked up through the day, to problem solve. You problem solve better if you slept well. But if you can agree as a team some of this stuff, what's the latest time you're going to send emails back to students, for instance? What's the latest you're going to be working on a document? Can we set some rules around all of that within the team? And then everybody supporting each other to do that, and encouraging each other to do that. So everybody's, trying to maintain those healthy lifestyle together. There might be some short-term pain from all of that, but actually over the long term, you'll probably find you're more productive and get more done to a higher quality level than if you just try and work 50 to 60 hours a week, because that isn't sustainable, and actually you're probably being less productive than you would be if you were rested.
Okay. Yeah, no, you're definitely right with the email side of things. We developed in our school an email policy to try and, curb the stem of emails flooding in all the time. But yeah, that's a tough one in and of itself.
It is, yes.
Yeah. Another one here about assessment. What do you feel about the balance of, yes, you want, a type of assessment, or sorry, a variety in types of assessments, so students get a chance to shine. But if you keep changing and give them too much variety, then they actually don't get a chance to practice that type of assessment, and then they don't really get to shine, perhaps. Any thoughts about the balance between new versus repeat types of assessment?
Yeah, that is tricky, absolutely, because we do want to make sure that our students are doing something that they're used to doing. I guess for me, the key about this is the issue about constructive alignment. Why are we choosing a particular method of assessment? And is it a good way of assessing the skill, understanding, and knowledge that we want the students to have at that time? We don't have to use dozens of different types of assessment, but a mix of, maybe 3 or 4 that students can get used to using. And that have relevance to what they're doing. So if you are on a science degree, it makes sense that some of your assessments are lab-based experiments, or if you're in a geography or geology course, that you're going to look at building skills around field work, for instance. So it's probably not doing too many, not having a completely new type of assessment each time, but whatever we're doing, that we make sure we have trained students to do it first, where there wasn't a grade attached to it that they would necessarily see as that they're going to suffer as a result of all of it. So the classic one is around group work or presentations. If you're going to do a group work activity, you need to teach them how to work in a group first, because it's not a thing that comes naturally. Or if you're going to get people to do presentations, give them 1 or 2 classes about how to present well, so that they actually have some confidence that they have the skills in order to do that. And you can work with colleagues across the institution, bring colleagues across the institution to bring them in if you've got them, to help you do all of that. But that we make sure that what we're actually assessing is core competence to the program, to the discipline, so that it has meaning, it has relevance, and students are then able to engage with it. It is a difficult balance, and it moves around from discipline to discipline. But as long as you make sure that students feel confident that they know what they're being asked to do and that they have the skills to do it, you can mix up a number of different types. And you can get there through more ways than just getting them to do the assessment itself. But it depends on how many hours you have, what size of cohort you have, and what your discipline is, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question here. So, at risk of adding to, further student burnout and stress, have you got any recommendations on any data that we could collect from students using any particular instruments? If we wanted any quantifiable data, if we want to try and gauge the anxiety levels in our cohorts, have you got any sort of suggestions for us measuring that, like I said, without causing even more undue stress on them?
So I'd be wary about using clinical instruments if you're not a clinician. I'm not sure that gathering mass data like that would be useful. I think it'd probably be more helpful to use something like Michelle Morgan's pre-arrival questionnaire, particularly for first-year students, where you're looking at what's their academic preparedness, because that'll on level of confidence and things like that. That'll probably tell you more useful information about things that you could actually then go and do with it. Because if if it comes back, you've got a cohort coming in who are massively anxious, I'm not sure that tells the average academic an awful lot about what they could actually do. But if you find it about their academic preparedness, their sense of academic self-belief, how capable and ready they think they are, and what they think might be missing, well, it tells you some things that you could actually practically then do about it. So for an academic member staff, I think I would point you towards something that focuses more on academic readiness. And there's an academic preparedness questionnaire that's out there as well. So I would look at something like that rather than looking at one of the clinical measures of anxiety, because I think that just leaves you worrying. You've got a lot of anxiety without really knowing what's behind it and what you can do about it. Whereas if you know the bit that's about academic preparedness, you can do something to address that as students are coming in. That will be actually useful, and then will reduce their anxiety overall if they are anxious.
Yeah, good points. You were talking about, obviously the whole institution needs to join up better together on this. In what ways do you see that student support and other professional services can help inform and develop the curriculum, and how much should we involve them? In what ways?
Yeah, I think this is one of our next challenges, and in many ways, if the pandemic hadn't come along, I think this might have been one of the developments that we would have seen. Is that I think those of us who are in student services do need to become more involved. It's a thing that happens a lot in Australia already, in supporting our academic colleagues to think about this kind of thing, because there are some fairly simple, straightforward things that can very often be done within curriculum, and a lot of it's just about good teaching and learning, to be honest. But to think about ways in which we can encourage students into good behaviors that just help them to learn and maintain their well-being, because those two things are very often linked. Things that are good for student learning are very often good for their well-being as well. So I think it is the thing we need to do. I'm not sure every student services department in the country would necessarily have the capacity to do that yet, but I think that gives us an opportunity, because I think actually sharing our experience, academics and student services coming together and saying, well, you know stuff I don't, and I know stuff you don't, let's have a conversation. That it creates the possibility for shared learning, which I think could help really build those relationships between academic colleagues and student services colleagues. So I don't think those absences of knowledge need to scare us, but I think where those conversations have taken place across the sector, they've been really powerful and done really good work. So I would like to see far more of those kinds of conversations happening, and seeing much more of an involvement, much more of an expectation that student services are involved in those conversations to help academic staff avoid difficulties down the line, and then have a curriculum that actually just supports good well-being, so that less of that burden is falling on academics in terms of students experiencing poor well-being.
Okay, just one last question for you, because I'm aware of our time here. You mentioned about the importance of normalising. So what does that look like for your average member of staff with their students? What sorts of things, how would they work that out in practice in terms of normalising?
I think you can do it in a number of different ways. I mean, there's the kind of academic authenticity route of the academic themselves standing up and saying, we've just come through a pandemic. It's disrupted my learning as much as it has yours. But this doesn't mean we need to be afraid of this. I think it's about setting out the fact that Disruptions to learning can happen a lot. You know, if someone's sick for 4 to 6 weeks, they're going to miss a big chunks of teaching, but it doesn't mean that their degree at the end of it is going to be any the poorer for it. I think it's looking for those kinds of conversations with students and having just kind of open conversations with students and letting them talk about their experiences and saying, yeah, absolutely, hear that, understand that. We will address that in the content that we teach. We will address that in class to enable you to catch back up again. But you know, don't worry about it. It's the same for all of us. We're all in the same place here. We're all going to move forward together. It's not you on your own, because that's what a lot of students experience and what they think. We're all in that bubble together, and we'll all move forward together, and we will all get caught up. I think just having those conversations and not just doing it at the beginning of the year in kind of your opening talk, but drip feeding it throughout the whole of the first semester, possibly the whole of the next year, so that you keep calling back to, look, you might be missing something here, and that's okay. Let's look at that. Let's address it. Let's build it. Learning doesn't happen in a straight line anyway, so it doesn't matter if you're learning this in a different order. I think that's what normalizing looks like.
Yeah, no, fantastic. So that I'm just aware of our time, folks, here. So just to say once again, Gareth, thank you so much for coming to join us here. Their QAAS Scotland work that's ongoing. Thanks to everyone else for giving up your busy time away from marking, assessment boards, whatever else is going on for you just now. Normalise. It's very difficult. So as mentioned earlier, the recording will be made available on the cluster webpage. We have missed a small bit of the recording in the middle, about 4 slides worth due to technical problems, but the slides will be there, and feel free to circulate those amongst your networks. So just thanks again, everyone, and bye-bye for just now.